Hello everyone, my name is Catherine Yolanchik, and my presentation is on the history of Mary Prince, a West Indian slave. So, who was Mary Prince? Mary Prince was born into enslavement in Brackish Pond, Bermuda around 1788. She was separated from her family at the age of 10 and brought to Antigua, and from Antigua she eventually traveled to England in 1828. She became the first woman to present an anti-slavery petition to Parliament, and notably the first Black woman to write and publish an autobiography. Her book, The History of Mary Prince, a West Indian Slave, was a key part of the anti-slavery campaign during her time, and she passed around 1833 while living in England. So, Mary Prince's family. Her mother was a household slave on a farm belonging to Mr. Charles Miners. Her father, Prince, was a shipbuilder Sawyer belonging to Mr. Trimmingham, a shipbuilder at Crow Lane. She had 3 younger brothers and 2 sisters, Hannah and Dinah, and upon Miner's death in 1788, Mary, her mother, and her siblings were sold as household servants to Captain Darrell. Mary Prince eventually then became a companion servant to Darrell's youngest granddaughter, Betsy Williams. She married her husband, Daniel James, a former slave who worked as a carpenter and cooper, in December of 1826, and unfortunately received very severe punishment for marrying a free slave and was separated from her husband only 2 years later. And again, she was never able to reunite with her husband. Regarding her education, she never received a formal education. However, 2 years after arriving in Antigua in 1815, she joined the Moravian Church, and this is where she learned how to read. And despite having no formal education, Prince went on to be recognized as a national hero of Bermuda for her work to abolish slavery. Her life as a slave during the 1800s. Mary Prince worked in very poor conditions in the salt ponds as a child. The water reached up to workers' knees, which were left uncovered and susceptible to severe damage. She was forced to work up to 17 hours straight exposed to the sun and heat. And she lived through various abusive slave owners who would threaten her with physical punishment in order to complete her tasks. In 1815, Mary was sold a 4th time to John Adams Wood of Antigua, who was notably the most abusive owner that she had, and a lot of her narrative was dedicated to writing about her time with the Woods family. She worked in his household as a domestic slave, attending the bedchambers, nursing a young child, and washing clothes. And shortly after being with the Woods family, she began suffering from rheumatism, which is a form of arthritis. I wanted to include this passage because I feel like it is the beginning of her expressing her pain and also expressing her want to, of course, gain freedom, and also her being very brave because the Woods family, again, was not a good family and they did not treat her well. So the passage goes as follows. After this, I fell ill again with the rheumatism and was sick a long time. But whether sick or well, I had my work to do. About this time, I asked my master and mistress to let me buy my own freedom. With the help of Mr. Burchell, I could have found the means to pay Mr. Wood, for it was agreed that I should afterwards serve Mr. Burchell a while, for the cash he wants to advance for me. I was earnest in the request to my owners, but their hearts were hard, too hard to consent. Mrs. Wood was very angry. She grew quite outrageous. She called me a black devil and asked me who had put freedom into my head. To be free is very sweet, I said, but she took good care to keep me a slave. I saw her change color and I left the room. So, in this passage from the history of Mary Prince, she expresses the pain of her arthritis from years of gruesome work as a slave. However, despite this pain, she was still forced to perform labor-intensive jobs. And Prince also attempts to express her hope for freedom to her then owner, Mrs. Woods. However, she was quickly shut down and once more felt defeated. Mary Prince's journey to England, I believe this was a very pivotal point in her life because her life drastically changed once she met certain people and groups of people in England. So at this point, she had worked for the Woods family for over 10 years. She was taken to England in 1828. And while the transport of slaves to England was made illegal in 1772, slavery in England was still legal despite what the public believed. She greatly wished to be emancipated by the Woods family in order to return to her husband in Antigua, and of course she had no means to support herself outside of living with the Woods family. She took shelter with the Moravian Church in Hatton Garden, and later began working with Thomas Pringle, an abolitionist writer and secretary to the Anti-Slavery Society. Pringle tirelessly fought for Prince's freedom, however, it was continuously denied by Adams Wood. Luckily, she was able to successfully escape from the Woods family, and they eventually left back to Antigua in 1829, leaving Mary Prince in England. Again, they did still have legal ownership over Mary Prince. There was also a bill that was introduced to free all slaves from the West Indies in England whose owners had freely brought them. However, it did not pass, but this also marked another pivotal point in history because the discussion to abolish slavery was becoming more and more present. So I chose a few significant passages from her narrative, this one being her time when she met a woman by the name of Hill who told her about the Anti-Slavery Society. She ended up going to their office to inquire if they could do anything to get her freedom and send her back to the West Indies. Now, at this point, she obviously had hoped to be reunited with her husband. However, she quickly found out that that was not possible, and even if she did gain her freedom, she would have to stay in England. And again, Mr. Woods, being the type of man he was completely against letting her come back to Antigua and be with her husband and gain her freedom there. She also describes that this was the first winter that she spent in England, and she suffered severe pain from the cold due to her arthritis, which she said at times still tormented her. So this physical pain was obviously going to be a constant reminder in her life due to her harsh past. And she says, however, Providence was very good to me, and I got many friends, especially some Quaker ladies, who, hearing of my case, came and sought me out, and gave me good, warm clothing and money. Thus, I had great cause to bless God in my affliction. So by this point, even though Mary Prince was still suffering from the mental and physical pain of course, being a slave a majority of her life, and at this point still not gaining her freedom, she was beginning to meet good people who were actually wanting to take care of her and be there for her. The next significant passage essentially just commemorates her thanks to Mr. and Mrs. Pringle. Her life quickly began to change for the better, but she always throughout her narrative, reminded people that the harsh reality of her past was incredibly difficult to deal with. And of course, she was also left with the physical reminder of her past through her arthritis. So, the publication of the history of Mary Prince. Mary Prince was heavily inspired and encouraged by Thomas Pringle, and in December of 1829, Pringle officially hired Prince to work in his household. At the time, Pringle arranged for Prince's narrative to be transcribed by Susanna Strickland. Strickland was an English-born Canadian author who wrote about her own experiences as a settler in Canada, which was a British colony at the time. Thomas Pringle served as the editor for Mary Prince's narrative, and her book, The History of Mary Prince, was published in 1831. Thomas Pringle made sure to include the severe maltreatment and cruelty towards slaves, especially women. Pringle highlighted some of the most difficult times in Mary Prince's life. He ensured the public knew the torment Mary endured throughout her life as a slave since birth. The book itself caused quite a stir in England at the time because it was the first ever published narrative written about a black woman's life. The book also adamantly stated the abolition of slavery was absolutely necessary. Slavery throughout the 18th century. In the year 1800, there were nearly 500,000 slaves in the British West Indies. During this time, Britain's economy was supported by an abundance of incredibly wealthy slave traders. By the year 1830, the slave trade had been abolished, and legislation to free all slaves in British dependencies followed 3 years later in 1833. Anti-slavery campaigns were crucial during the 30-year transition, and women such as Mary Prince were especially inspiring and influential. Her main support system during this time was the Anti-Slavery Society. Prince told her life story to abolitionist sympathizers and eventually was able to publish her life-altering narrative to the public. Relevancy of the text today. While slavery was abolished nearly 200 years ago, the remnants of discrimination, racism, and sexism have somehow managed to linger into the world of today. While the hardships of specific groups of people vary largely than the experience of Mary Prince, a vast majority of people, specifically people of color, continue to fight for their equality. The Black Lives Matter movement that took the world by storm this year is a perfect example that the fight for equality for people of color is hardly over. Opposing sides, such as the All Lives Matter movement, who, mind you, adamantly believe there are no issues of equality for people of color, are living proof that intolerable and ignorant minds continue to exist in today's society. I don't believe it is the decision of an opposing group to classify what it means to be equal, nor do I believe it is ethical to fight opposing groups with hateful speech and/or violence. Mary Prince made grave sacrifices during her time, fully knowing she could very well be punished for speaking her mind. Influential figures such as Mary Prince are part of the long history of people who are willing to speak their minds despite the backlash of the public. In turn, they will continue to inspire the minds of people today. So my two discussion questions I have, the first one being the Thomas Pringle and the Anti-Slavery Society were incredibly influential support systems for Mary Prince during her time. Do you believe she would have been able to pursue her dream of publishing her narrative had they not been around? And the second question is, while the mistreatment of slaves was fairly well known during the 1800s, why do you believe Mary Prince's narrative was so life-altering during her time? And I will link this video below for you guys so you're able to watch it. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Thank you.